I first ordered Go Brewing online, and Sunshine State instantly became one of my favorite beers. Then I tried the Story Double IPA, and it was game over. Founder Joe Chura, who's actually been a guest on this podcast, leads the team making award winning non alcoholic craft beer right in house with real ingredients and legit brewing methods. With over a dozen styles, there's something for everyone. Go to gobrewing.com. Free shipping on orders over $200 and 2-day delivery. Save an additional 15% with code NATION15. That's NATION15. All right. Michael Colangelo is the CEO of Nota Bene Flavors, where he offers fractional bespoke flavor chemistry consulting to beverage brands. His past experience has included stints at various companies, ranging from big companies like Pfizer early in his career to smaller beverage companies. In the NA space itself, he has worked with brands that include Surely and their sister brand in the mid-strength category, Arlow Wines. So, Michael, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to the US of NA.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, John.
Great. Well, I think this is a very timely conversation. You know, we're sitting here in dry January right now, and I think there's new people who are coming into the NA category. And I think, you know, there's a lot of questions just about the health and wellness aspect, which is maybe not not the sole draw to the category, but certainly is one that brings a lot of a lot of people into it. So, you know, first off, tell us a little bit about your career journey. So I mentioned Pfizer, you know, earlier in your career, I assume working on, you know, more on the pharmaceutical side and, you know, liquid medicines and things like that. I promise we won't blame you for the taste of cough syrup. I'm sure you did the best you could. And then obviously, you know, parlaying that into working for various beverage brands. You've worked for a number of ones that are favorites of mine and probably many of our, you know, viewers and listeners as well. So tell us a little bit about your career journey.
So I really got my start as a chemist. That's what I went to college for. I got my start actually at Procter and Gamble, doing analytical chemistry, so measuring the amount of active material in your anti-dandruff shampoo or the materials in makeup. And kind of from there got my sort of foot in the door at Givaudan doing flavor chemistry, just a little technician in the lab making things up for senior flavor chemists, and really, kind of fell in love with the idea of flavors, the chemistry, how does science meet biology, chemistry meet biology, and really understanding how what I had learned throughout my college career, how that applies to what we interact with in the world, what we eat, what we drink, what we smell, what we taste. And so over the years, I've followed that journey, as I've gotten deeper and deeper. And, so obviously, like you mentioned, I worked at Pfizer, pharmaceutical and over-the-counter medicine, moved to a company out in the Bay Area called Flavor Insights, where I ran the flavor creation and application department for a few years, where really that's where I got my intro into more of the supplement and sports nutrition space and sort of the innovation side of beverage. Smaller companies with an idea doing something really wild and innovative, and they would need help, and they could come to us for that kind of help. And so that's where I started to transition from just doing, flavor chemistry in a lab to helping people with product innovation. How do you bring your new idea to life through the lens of flavor and experience? And so I've sort of continued down that journey, working with different startups, and most recent full-time gig was with Shirley and Arlo, helping them, design their wine portfolio for the NA and the low alcohol space. And then at the beginning of the year, started consulting full-time, sort of a way to bring my expertise, my knowledge, my background, my resources, all of my contacts to a variety of, you know, new brands, new companies, spreading the wealth, so to speak, trying to help as many people as I can, because there's a lot of people with amazing ideas and they need help on how to make it work, how to make it scale, how to make it sell, all those kinds of things.
Sure. No, we hear that all the time. There's obviously building a brand, but the liquid has to be good,
Mhm.
and needing people like yourself will have that expertise and that background and chemistry to bring those right flavor profiles to the forefront. So I want to talk about Shirley and Arla a little bit, which I see over your left shoulder some Shirley and over your right shoulder, I think some Arlo wines, which is great. They're a favorite brand of ours. We had Brandon, the current CEO, on our podcast, I believe, about a year or so ago.
Mhm.
So was that your first introduction to the NA space, or had you been working at all in the NA space prior to that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, actually, it was. So the job I was in before was more of a green chemistry, fintech type company, doing molecular beverage research. So how do you make wine without grapes? I'm probably going to butcher the stat, but it takes something like 600 gallons to make a single bottle of wine on average. There's, low water intensity farming and whatnot, and those take far less. But, when you average out the amount of water it takes to make a wine, it's a lot of water. And then moving wine across the country consumes a lot of CO2 and produces a lot of greenhouse gases due to trucking and everything. And so I was in that space working on how to create wine without wine. I mean, that was one of the projects. And so when that company folded and I was kind of looking for the next gig, I ended up kind of bumping into the Shirley team, and they were struggling with, a few things. And I'd done a ton of research into the background and chemistry of wine and how to, reconstitute it without grapes, and sort of kind of bringing two different spheres of knowledge together to try and, solve some problems in the NA space. So yeah, I wasn't in the NA space much at all. I mean, I tried some NA drinks and kind of enjoyed them, but it wasn't part of my background or portfolio at the time.
Yeah, no, and I know the wine space, I think, in the NA world has been much maligned, and I tell people all the time, and those of us who are trying it on a regular basis, it's really evolved and gotten a lot better, I think, over the past couple of years. Certainly in the time that you've been involved there, and I'm sure you've impacted that where you've had the opportunity. So you've been or you've had experience in the NA space going back 3, maybe 4 years now. What are your thoughts on the no low space, on where it is, and what first attracted you to it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think what first attracted me to it is the challenge. Um, the idea of making a wine or a cocktail or a beer without alcohol. Like I said, I come from a chemistry background. Ethanol is a wildly unique ingredient. It's just toxic enough for it to be safe for us to consume, but still have an impact on the psychology. But also, what a lot of people don't think about is the actual chemistry of alcohol. And so ethanol has a very unique type of chemistry that makes it rather difficult to recreate products that contain it. It lowers the surface tension of the product, it increases the vapor pressure, it does a lot of things to the beverage, some technical stuff there that like what that really means is it makes products more aromatic. It gives products more mouthfeel. It gives products a bite. It does things sensorially to a beverage that you can't really recreate without it. And so how do you do that with, an NA beverage that, especially a wine, which so much of its entire sensory portfolio is based on the production of ethanol and how that works within the system. And so, the average bottle of wine contains between 12 and 14% alcohol by volume. You remove that much alcohol from the equation, it doesn't taste the same. So how do you give someone that experience of drinking a really great cab or a really great Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc when you don't have one of the most fundamental pieces of the equation?
Yeah. No, and it's interesting. You were talking about ethanol and the flavor profile of the, it has its own flavor profile that it brings to a beverage that it's in the alcohol world. And it feels like the space has really evolved over the past couple of years, especially from a perception standpoint, where it's, the stats show that at least 80% or more of people who are buying NA products or NA drinks are also drinking alcohol at various other times.
Mhm.
And so it's not just necessarily for somebody who might be choosing to be sober all the time, or, going a sober lifestyle. So I guess, given that most of the people who are drinking these beverages are also drinking alcohol at other times, how does that impact your job and in terms of, creating those flavor profiles, given that dynamic. And I think too, you see the industry splitting off a little bit where there's still the substitutes of products that are, trying to be more one to one. I think NA beer is probably the easiest example of that. Is still, barley and hops without the alcohol. I think in the wine space you see a little more creativity. But just
Mhm.
curious from your perspective and your angle from where you see the industry, how that impacts things.
I think it actually helps quite a bit. Thinking about it from sort of a product perception and sensory experience, the sort of the legacy, consumer who's looking for their exact glass of Cabernet without alcohol, that's nearly impossible to do, right? To make a cab that tastes exactly like its alcohol or alcoholic brother. Like it's just not it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be identical, and that's an incredible challenge to try and make a one for one swap, particularly in wine, also in cocktails. Um, and so I think having sort of the newer generation of consumers who are you know I think the term is zebra striping, but alternating alcohol, non-alcohol, or, hey, I'm going to take a few days off and then I'm going to have an alcoholic beverage, on Friday or Saturday. It helps because they're not expecting the perfect one for one swap. They're looking for, generally speaking, most of those consumers seem to be looking for something that still reminds them of it and still gives them the experience they're looking for, the flavor and taste experience that they want. And they're more willing to overlook a few of the differences. You can still make a fantastic glass of wine. You can still make a fantastic cocktail without alcohol. And there's super fun beverages out there all throughout the marketplace. Out here in the Bay, I mean, every bar and restaurant now has an NA program of, personally crafted NA cocktails at the bar. Like there's so many different options now of really amazing flavor experiences without alcohol. I think that is a benefit or a result of people who are also still consuming alcohol and have that a better understanding of what they're looking for and what to expect. And so you're not beholden to making, this perfect one for one match anymore. You're beholden to making a really great flavor experience that stands up, but it doesn't need to be, perfection.
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit about, I think the alignment with wellness, which, I think we could probably, a topic for a different podcast could be, does NA belong in that category or not? It seems to be a lot of people are thinking of it in that sense, and that may be one of the attractions to getting in the categories I mentioned earlier. And I think with that, and just part of current trends and what people are looking at is getting into ingredients. And I guess before I go into the questions, just an acknowledgement. I think there's been a lot of debate about this topic, and we're certainly not here to tell anybody what they should or shouldn't feel about things like sugar content. What works for one person may not work for another. But that being said, would love just to get your perspective as a chemist and someone with a background on that side of the equation about some of these different things, starting with the sugar side of things. So we do see. We do see some of these beverages that may contain quite a bit of sugar. I know that's something that's been a focus of a lot of the different beverage brands that have really come out to try to maybe pull back on that. But there are some that still have quite a bit of sugar intake involved, and some of those are certainly in the NA wine space. You also see, I think, a prevalence of a lot of sugar substitutes. I can think of many brands that use stevia, for example, which obviously is not just an NA thing. That's something that's used in, beverages across the spectrum outside the category. But, I guess what considerations should people think about, when they're giving that consideration to sugar intake in a beverage, and, what's sort of your perspective on that?
Yeah, this is a topic that comes up a lot. Discovery calls, LinkedIn, various conversations. What should I be afraid of? Is sort of the way I frame it in my head and I think it's a dangerous, sort of framing or a dangerous question to go down because, like you said, it is such a personal decision based on your own personal health and your own personal goals. Um, I think I try to help people understand this in the macro rather than each individual drink that they have, right? Um, I think when you talk about sugar in particular, yes, we should limit or reduce how much sugar we're taking in. In the modern, sort of beverage landscape, a lot of beverages have far too much sugar. And so I think it is an admirable and the right path to continue to try to reduce it. However, biochemically, we're programmed to love it and need it. It's a cheap source of energy. And so, you're never going to get rid of all of it from your diet, or at least you probably shouldn't get rid of all of it from your diet. I think it's more about choosing, you know, sort of discerningly and making sure that you're choosing, better sources of different sugars. I don't fundamentally see anything wrong with cane sugar, right? Sucrose, it's cheap, it's available, it's not an unhealthy material. It becomes unhealthy in the fact that you drink too much of it. If you consume too much sugar, it's bad for you. But there are a whole different category of different sugars that go well beyond just cane sugar or sucrose. You have fructose and you have glucose, or dextrose is the plant version. You have a new sugar that's been out for a number of years, but it's gaining popularity is allulose. So there's a lot of different sugars. There's a lot of different ways to get sugars as well into your system. And so, you know, we can definitely have a very in-depth debate about whether it's better to have sugar from juice than it is from cane sugar or from corn or wherever. But it's a difficult conversation, and I think reduction in sugar is good. But as a consumer, I would try to look at it more in the macro. How much sugar am I taking in daily from all of my sources versus one beverage over another beverage? Is this sugar content in this beverage, too high or too low? Well, that kind of depends on what's the rest of your diet look like, and what else are you consuming, and how much sugar are you getting elsewhere. And then one side note on the sugar debate: wine does not have hardly any sugar. Most alcoholic beverages don't have much sugar at all. The primary source of caloric intake is ethanol. Alcohol has 7 calories per gram. So the alcohol alone in a standard glass of wine is around 110 calories before you add anything else into it. So there's this common misnomer that alcoholic beverages are really high in sugar, and that's really not the case. It's the alcohol that's driving caloric intake. And so I think, it drives a deeper point home is understanding what's in your beverage and where are your calories coming from? Where's the sugar coming from? Where's the protein and the minerals coming from? So I try to recommend people to take the macro view. It's okay to have a high sugar beverage occasionally. It's not a
Right.
problem.
Yeah. No, it's like, when do I choose to have that piece of cake after I eat my dinner,
Exactly.
or, whatever. It's finding moderation with some of those things.
Yeah.
And I guess as a follow up to that, and all that certainly tracks. I think we're in a trend right now where reduced sugar products. I was just reading an article again. I think this goes well beyond the NA space, where the reduced sugar category is just doing phenomenally well.
Mhm.
Huge growth in grocery stores. It's what people are looking for. They're looking for that balance between, not having it at all, and obviously something that's a little bit higher in sugar. I was
Mhm.
curious, before we let go of this topic and move on, in terms of the sugar substitutes or derivatives like a stevia, do you have any thoughts on what people should be thinking about when they're looking at something like those, like a stevia?
Yeah, I mean, you're still going to have, a response, a biochemical response to the sweetness. Your gut is going to pick up on the sweetness response and produce insulin, and so I think this is why try to take the macro view is those high intensity sweeteners, stevia, monk fruit, even on the artificial side like sucralose, those will have a biochemical response. There's still some debate and research, conflicting how much of a response do you have when you take them in. But I think it gets at a larger point that, we are programmed to like sweet things. It's enjoyable to drink sweet stuff, eat sweet cake, cookies, and so just balancing that, I think, is important. And then I think the last point is that you should enjoy what you eat and drink, right? Like enjoy it. Don't feel guilty or so guilty all the time about what you're consuming, that it takes all the fun out of, exploring the beverage space. I mean, there's so many good options out there to try and trial and see what's new. And so I think, you know, those sugar substitutes can help more people enjoy more things by reducing sugar content. For people who do need to reduce it or people who are trying to reduce it. But I think they have their own flavor profile. They have their own considerations. Kind of understanding what you like and you don't like, and kind of trying to figure out what you enjoy. I think that's the important part. I've developed a ton of beverages that use stevia and monk fruit. I've developed a ton of beverages that use sucralose. Um, and they all have their own unique flavor profile. Some people really love it, some people really don't, and that's okay. I think if you're trying to develop a new product, I think it speaks to the larger point of knowing your audience. If you're going after an audience, stevia has a bad reputation right now for some of the taste components that it has. I think some of that's based more out of usage of poor stevia extract than stevia itself. But I think knowing your audience, knowing what they're gonna gravitate towards, and some of their preconceived biases or notions can help you create a beverage that's going to be more successful, especially when you're using ingredients that are maybe a little more challenging to work with than, just a classic cane sugar.
Right. No, that's very well said. And before we let go, I guess completely of this topic and let you off the hot seat here a little bit, I think the second part of that on the ingredient side would be around the chemical additives, and this is probably one that's maybe a little more poorly understood. I think people have a general idea of sugar and, finding the balance, and they have some understanding of things like stevia and some of the substitutes out there on the sugar side. But there's a lot of ingredients out there, many of which, to my understanding, are there more from a preservative standpoint that can also be classified by some as negatives that you don't want to have. And the whole kind of natural versus chemical debate, which I know is rarely as black and white as it may seem. So I guess within the universe that we're talking about here of NA beverages, same question regarding chemical additives. What are considerations? What should people keep in mind? And what education, I guess, would you encourage people to think about as they're looking at these labels?
Yeah, this is a spicy topic, for sure, and it's out there a lot, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think, first of all, I think there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of people pushing a narrative. So I think, understand your source, understand, who is the person that is telling you this. What are they actually getting from this conversation, or what are they trying to sell you? In many cases, a lot of the people pushing, the what I kind of call, and I didn't dub it, I heard it somewhere, but chemophobia, so the fear of chemicals.
Mm,
Just be cautious, I think, is my recommendation of where you're getting your information from, where your source information is from. Um, Everything around us, macro view here, everything around us is chemicals, right? The water you drink, the air you breathe, the chair you sit on, the desk in front of you, right? Everything is a chemical, and um, toxicity is made by the dose, not by the material necessarily. I mean, obviously there are some exceptions to that. There are materials that are toxic regardless of dose. And so sugar is a good example. Water's another one, right? You drink too much water, you drown your cells. So I think understanding the macro, that everything is made of chemicals and you don't need to be afraid of chemicals broadly. To dive kind of deeper into that and talk more specifically about chemical additives and preservatives, um, the FDA has done a ton of background research. Everything that goes into approval gets GRAS status, generally recognized as safe, has to go through a very lengthy and rather expensive process to be approved by the FDA for use. The EU has their own list. They, in fact, mirror each other quite well. Um, the way that the EU list is written is different than the FDA list. The FDA list puts everything into the GRAS list, so packaging,
mm,
processing equipment, everything goes in there, as opposed to the EU breaking it out. So, sort of an aside, I've heard people talk about how the EU has only, 400 or 500 grass food additive items and the FDA has 10,000. Well, actually, if you strip out all the non-food
Mm,
additive items from the grass list in the FDA, they're actually relatively the same. There's a few items that are approved here that aren't approved there, and a few items approved there that aren't approved here. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. And so I think this is where it gets really difficult when you start talking about specific additives, preservatives, different chemical components. Is there's some relatively new research, um, none of it in very large clinically controlled
hmm
trial studies like you would see at a Pfizer. No like 10,000, 20,000 patients, control group, double blind study thing going on. They tend to be rather small group observational studies or very basic type trial work. And some of that is showing that a few of the chemical preservatives that have been used, sodium benzoate being one, might have a link to, you know, negative health effects. How you want to interpret that, take your pick, right? I mean, I think if something scares you enough that you don't want to consume it, there's plenty of options out there, right? You don't have to be afraid of, or fearful or anything about choosing not to consume an item because you don't like it, and that's okay. I do think though that the misinformation has driven this conversation, to a fever pitch, where people want everything out, and the artificial dyes are a great example of that. It's in my opinion kind of the wrong piece of the equation that we're talking about.
yeah.
I think our discussion around sugar is much more important in
Yeah.
nutrition and not chemical preserve. Yeah, should we take chemical preservatives out of food? Some of them, yeah, probably. We probably should. We probably should find better ways of doing that. We have the knowledge now, we have the resources and the, ability to create beverages that are shelf stable without sodium benzoate. you know, yeah, we probably should be doing that. If it's an unnecessary additive, then, don't worry, don't add it, don't use it. If it is a necessary additive, then okay, that's fine. But that might mean that some people won't consume your product, and that's okay too. But I think it boils down to ensuring that people are, getting the information from reputable sources, have, an understanding of where these things come from, what their use is, what their purpose is. It's a tough marketplace. I mean, there's a lot of information out there bombarding people, and it's hard to sift through it and
Yeah.
understand what's real and what's pushing a narrative to sell product.
Yeah. That's definitely true. And using myself as an example, I mean, I'm more focused on this category than the average person just because of things like this podcast and whatnot. And I think about, and yet there's still many questions that I have, and certainly many things that I don't understand around some of these different things. But I think the theme that I'm hearing from you over and over is education. Educate yourself on the issues, just be aware of what those various data sources are and what they're grounded in, and make a decision for yourself on whatever you find to be an acceptable level of whatever it is you're looking for,
Mhm.
or trying to do with that. So that certainly makes a lot of sense to me. So before we let you go, I guess a two-part question. So any big trends that you're seeing in the no and low category for this year, and as a second part to that, any exciting projects that you're really into right now? I know you may not be able to tell us about stuff that might not be on the market yet, but feel free to answer that however you want to.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think trends, there are definitely some interesting ones. I think with the increase in, moderation drinking rather than abstention drinking in the NA space, um, there's been a lot of talk about, novel and interesting experiences, flavor experiences. So, I think I'm seeing a lot more asks or a lot more requests for, flavor types that are not the norm, right? They're different fusion flavors, or they're exotic fruit flavors, or they want, fusions between fruit and botanicals, or so I think I think as the space grows, the trends do seem to be more focused on novel experience over, that classic one-to-one like we talked about earlier. So I've definitely seen some things around, yuzu and lemon balm and sort of the blending of nutrition or supplement world with the NA space where they're looking for, some kind of functional experience, rhodiola or L-theanine to provide some anti-anxiety or things. So I think, I think we're going to see more expansion of the space, and I mean expansion from like an experience level where it's not going to be so narrowly focused on, traditional beverage experience.
Yeah.
It's getting wider and wider, and I think that's super fun because it gives you a lot of new stuff to work on. And that, yeah, can't break confidentiality agreements, but there are definitely a few beverages that are launching this coming year that I think stay tuned for. There's some cool ones that are about to come out, I think. Both in the NA space, but also in sort of the functional and low alcohol space. There's some cool stuff that a few clients of mine have been working on.
Awesome. No, that's great. We look forward to that. And it's exciting to hear you say, moving a little bit further away from the one-to-one. And, to me, that's exciting. That feels more like creativity and coming up with beverages that may not taste like something, or they're not attempting to taste like something in the alcohol world, but redefining that space. And I think my evolution is probably similar to many, where I came in my case, it was NA beer, which obviously is more of a one-to-one. And as I got deeper into the category, just, started to get into things that really weren't trying to be substitutes, and, finding new flavors that I either like just as much, if not better than things in the alcohol world. So I think finding more of those will certainly be very exciting. And last point I was going to make before we wrap that up, we didn't really get into THC. I think you talked about some of the nootropics and L-theanine and some of those other ingredients. It'll be interesting to see with what's going on with THC on the hemp derived side, at least. Not talking about the recreational market, but the hemp derived, which obviously that there's legislation that could be taking effect in November if things don't change, which could obviously force a change into looking at different functional ingredients. So what impact that has on this whole space, I think will be really fascinating to see. So yeah, it's not going to be a
For sure.
quiet year. I think that's for sure.
No, not at all. There's a lot going on, and a lot of brands that had to, do some pivot or think about, how the legislation's going to impact their business, and so I think that's providing a lot of challenges for people, but I think it also provides a lot of opportunity for expansion or changes or adjustments. And the flavor space in the non-alc world has gotten so broad and really interesting and fun. So I'm excited to see that continue to accelerate.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think there's a lot of innovation happening. So we'll see how that plays out. Well, Michael, really appreciate you taking the time. I don't think we've had anybody, coming from your perspective on this show before. So really appreciate you not only giving your perspective on things, but I think wading into some topics that obviously are pretty hotly debated out there, and educating us a little bit. So we appreciate that, and look forward to staying in touch and talking to you again in the future.
Of course, thank you for having me. It was super fun. Love to share my experience.
Go Brewing really cracked the code on a THC infused drink that tastes like beer. I tried Easy Man Hazy and couldn't believe how flavorful and balanced it was. Founder Joe Chura, yep, the same guy who's been on this podcast, created Easy Man for the new wave of hybrid drinkers. Made with buckwheat, millet, and oats, it's not technically beer, but it sure tastes like it. With a smooth 1-to-1 THC to CBD ratio and low dose options, it's a mellow, balanced vibe. Hit drinkeasyman.com. Free shipping over $200 and 2-day delivery. Save an additional 15% with code NATION15. That's NATION15.